living so long? Well, obviously, it's because the people who are getting advice from doctors are getting inappropriate advice. If the advice that doctors were giving was correct, then there should be a lot of people living to be 100 who follow the doctor's advice. So we're going to look at some of that. First thing I wanted to do is get some scientific evidence on what it would take to live to be 100. And I look for an animal model. Being a veterinarian and a pathologist, I look for an animal model first. And I ran into, doing some research, I ran into some stuff that was published in the 1860s, 1863. One was written by William Banting on how to cure corpulence. Corpulence is an old-timey word for obesity. And this was back in 1863. And he talked about a low-carb diet, kind of like the Atkins diet. Maybe it should be the Banting diet, instead of the Atkins diet. And then in 1935, a guy who'd been doing all his research in the 1920s by the name of Clive McKay came out with his landmark article in 1935. And what he did was essentially take three groups of rats. Group number one, he gave the rat pellet of the day, and these rats lived to be an average of 2 years, which is really super. Because prior to this rat pellet coming out with all of the nutritional knowledge of the time, people who were using rats and mice and rabbits for research would give them rolled oats and carrots and cabbage and things like that, and they might live to be 11 months after weaning instead of 2 years. So it was really good to have a laboratory animal and a food that you could give them that routinely allowed them to live to be 2. He then took the second group, gave them the same basic pellet as group number one, but he cut the carbohydrate calories by 30%, kept the vitamins and minerals the same, and they lived to be 50% older, 3 years. Got kind of excited about that. Took group number 3, cut the carbohydrate calories from group number 1 by 60%, kept the vitamins and minerals the same, and they lived twice as long. They lived to be 4 years of age, and they really got excited about cutting this carbohydrate calories thing. But it wasn't just that. When they redid the studies with spiders and beetles and worms and pigeons and all kinds of animals, they found out that it was the density of the vitamins and minerals per remaining carbohydrate calorie. That was the basic reason, because he had always kept the vitamins and minerals the same when he dropped the calories. He didn't just drop the percentage of food, he dropped only the carbohydrate calories, keeping everything else the same. So in group number 3, there was like 3 times more vitamins and minerals per carbohydrate calorie than there was in group number 1. Now that I had an animal model and had some idea what to do, I began to look for a human model, and I ran into a guy by the name of Art Linkletter. How many of you heard of Art Linkletter? Okay, great guy. He was funny. I put he and Jack Benny and Red Skelton and Milton Berle all in the same group. They could tell funny stories without saying dirty words and things, and great family comedians. And Art Linkletter wanted to live to be 100. And he wanted to live to be 100 because he read this book. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book published in 1933 called Lost Horizon. It was written by James Hilton, and in this book, Lost Horizon, James Hilton coined the term Shangri-La. How many of you heard of Shangri-La? Okay, well, that's where that came from, that book. And Art Linkletter got real excited about living to be 100. Well, the book was actually written about a people called the Hunza. How many of you heard of the Hunzas? Okay, well, the Hunzas come from northeast of Pakistan, and they're a third world country, obviously, and Art Linkletter hired an eye doctor by the name of Alan Bannock, Dr. Alan Bannock. And this eye doctor was kind of an amateur farmer, and Art Linkletter funded him to go there for 6 months during the growing season and find out what their secret was to live to be 100. And it was very obvious from reading the book that Alan Bannock had not read Clive McKay's material on his rats. And he was just making lots of observations, didn't give his opinion what was important, but he was a very good observer. And one of the things he found out, these people were a third world country. They had no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no hospitals, no pharmacies, no clinics, no doctors. They just used home remedies like herbs and massage therapy and that sort of thing. And yet they were the healthiest and longest lived people on earth. They came from a little mountain range, a little known mountain range by the name of the Karakoram Mountains, about 800 miles east of the Himalayas. Oftentimes people say they're from the Himalayas, but they're from the Karakoram Mountains. And one of the things Dr. Bannock observed was that they would irrigate with water that was kind of gray and opaque. It had lots of silt in it from the glacier grinding up the mountain rocks. And they would irrigate with this glacial water full of this rock silt, this finely ground up rock silt, about the same particle size as talc. And it contained over 60 minerals. And they would irrigate with this. And as the water percolated down into their fields and their gardens, it left a ½ inch to 1 inch of this gray silt on top of the soil. And before it dried, they would run out with their hoes and rakes, and they would hoe and rake this silt down into the soil before it blew away. Now, these people lived at the 19,500-foot level. Now, at 19,500 feet, you can't grow corn and potatoes and rice. Okay? They could grow wheat and rye and barley, but because of the very short growing season, their yields were very, very tiny. Their only carbohydrate they ate during the day, was a little tortilla, one tortilla a day. Little tortilla, little round flatbread. That was it. No other carbohydrate. The majority of their food was goat and lamb and mutton and camel and things like yak and rabbits, and they'd get some wild sheep and goats in the area. They'd eat chickens and eggs. They didn't have fish in those areas. They were too high up for fish. And so they cooked in butter. They used milk and cheese and yogurt. They could store dairy protein as cheese and yogurt. And that was it. They had a little garden. They'd grow a little bit of cabbage and tomatoes. Nothing else. They would also take the wood ashes from their fires, their cooking and heating fires, and put it in their gardens. How many of you ever put wood ashes from a fire into your garden? Yeah. This is a very old European and Asian custom, and somehow somebody learned that by putting the wood ashes from your fires into your gardens, it increases the yields and makes the food taste better and so forth. Well, it turns out the wood ashes are the minerals that are left when you burn away the carbon in the wood. So now I had not only an animal model, but a human model. They had a renewable source of minerals in their food. They were on a low-carbohydrate diet. And to me, it seemed it explained why they lived to be a ripe old age and were very productive. I also began to collect birthday announcements and obituaries of people who lived to be 100. I wanted to see really what happened to people when they lived to be 100. So I'll show you a few. Ralph Charles from Somerset, Ohio, about in the middle of the state, back in October of 1999, turned 100, and they had a nice little newspaper article about him and told his story. And the fascinating thing to me about Ralph Charles was that at age 100, he was still piloting charter flights and paying passengers around the central part of the United States. He used his single-engine Aeronca aircraft. He didn't have any restrictions on his health papers or his license. Now, to me, he doesn't look like what you would expect a decrepit 100-year-old to look like. To me, he's very vibrant. He looks like he's maybe in his late 70s or early 80s, and he's 100 years old and still piloting. I mean, you can imagine if he had Alzheimer's disease, he'd get up there and he'd say, "Excuse me, ma'am, where are we going?" That'd make you nervous, wouldn't it? But he didn't have those problems, obviously. For you ladies, I'm going to throw in Connie Douglas Reeves. Back in September of 2002, she turned 101. When she turned 101, September 26, 2002, she was inducted into the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, and her personal motto was, "Always saddle your own horse." And to me, she looks like one of those feisty little people that wouldn't listen to a doctor. You know, she's got her thumbs in her belt, she's got her shoulders back, her chin's out. You can just imagine a doctor saying to her, "Look, Connie, you're 101 years old now. It's time to give up salt. We got to worry about your blood pressure. It's time to give up eggs and butter. We got to worry about your cholesterol." And she's going to say, "Well, up yours, doc, and I've been eating salt and butter since before you were born and eggs before you were born. I'm not going to give that up." You can just see her. She is not a shrinking violet. For those of you that are a little more genteel, in May of 2001, this fellow here, Harold Stilson from Deerfield Beach, Florida, turned 101, went out and played golf for his birthday, and he hit his 6th hole-in-one at 101. Now, you have to have a strong grip. You have to be able to see 108 yards. You know, you have to have good eye-hand coordination. You have to have a good memory. You can't have Alzheimer's disease. You can imagine getting that golf club up there and saying, "Is this baseball? I mean, what am I doing here?" Right? And so he's color coordinated. It doesn't get any better than that for 101 years old. I think he looks pretty good for 101. And this fella, Antonio Todd, from Sardinia, the island, formerly island nation west of the mainland of Italy, back in January of 2001, turned 112, and he attributed his longevity to drinking 1 glass of red wine a day. There's a certain amount of validity to that because in the red wine there are these antioxidants that we know reduce your risk of heart disease and cancer. But you can get those same antioxidants in fruits and vegetables, so you don't need to drink the wine necessarily. It doesn't seem to matter what you eat as long as you keep the carbohydrates down and the vitamins and minerals up. That seems to be the thread, the common thread between all 100-year-olds. I'll show you an example. This gal here, Dora Ramathebe from South Africa, was born in 1881, and in 1995 she turned 114. And when she was asked, Dora, what do you attribute your health and longevity to? She said, oh, I ate locusts, the grasshoppers. You know about grasshoppers here, right? Pumpkin seeds, tortoise meat, wild herbs, dried fruit, and a cup of coffee. You notice it doesn't say bread. You notice it doesn't say potatoes. It doesn't say rice. It doesn't say corn. The only carbohydrate might be a little bit of that dried fruit. She got her protein from the locust, from the grasshoppers, and the tortoise meat. She got her essential fatty acids from the pumpkin seeds. And if she ate the herbs grain, she got a little bit of vitamin C and folic acid and beta-carotene. And she lived to be 114. She probably lived longer than that. I didn't keep track of her after that birthday announcement. Yeah, crickets won't work. Okay. February 15th, 2003. This gal here, Maddie Owens, 119, died at age 119. And she grew up in South Carolina. And apparently, when she was born in 1883, she was still working in the cotton fields. Owens told her family of her hard work in the cotton fields. I guarantee you that she didn't have vaccinations. I guarantee you that she didn't have antibiotics. I guarantee you she didn't have 3 good square meals a day. But I'll bet you, because I spent a lot of time in Africa, 2 years in Africa, and I know what they did with their wood ashes from their cooking fires. They always put it in their gardens, even in Africa, for their cabbage and their tomatoes and beans and so forth. And so I bet that her parents put the wood ashes from their cooking fires into the gardens. And one of my favorite birthday announcements goes back to 1995. This was a birthday announcement for Jean Calment from France. And she was documented by the Guinness World Book of Records being the oldest living woman at the time. There was more than 200 women who claimed to be older than she, but they didn't have the paperwork to prove it. Jean Calment had the paperwork to prove, to the satisfaction of the Guinness World Book of Records, that February 21st, 1995, she was in fact 120. February 21st, 1996, she turned 121. February 21st, 1997, she turned 122. And she died in August of 1997 at age 122 years and 164 days. She died suddenly of a stroke. She was up cooking her eggs and singing Frère Jacques. Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques. Ah! Fell over dead. Didn't have Alzheimer's disease. She was bright and mentally alert until the moment she died. She didn't have cardiovascular disease. She didn't have diabetes. She didn't have cancer. And she did have rheumatoid arthritis in her hands. You can see, but that's pretty good. Lived to be 122 and a half. Die suddenly without being mentally infirm. I mean, that's the way to do it, right? I thought this one was kind of cute. I was in Adelaide, Australia, back in October of 2003 when this came out in an Australian newspaper. World's oldest man dies at 122. A Cambodian tiger hunter by the name of Sek Yi, who is also the martial arts expert, attributed his longevity and that of his wife, I'm assuming a widow now, Long Uk, 108, to smoking and prayer. That's kind of a strange combination. But I'm sure he had got some mineral somewhere. Again, this is an Australian newspaper. It came out in March of 2003. A Brazilian believed to be the world's oldest woman died at age 124. Maria Etelvina dos Santos died of a stroke. Her birth certificate says she was a descendant of African slaves born in July of 1878. Do you think she got vaccinations and antibiotics? Do you think she had 3 good square meals a day? No, she was born in a straw hut caulked with cow dung. And probably led a pretty miserable life as she was growing up. But I guarantee you they put their wood ashes from their cooking fires into the gardens. And they didn't have doctors, and they didn't have hospitals and clinics, and they didn't have pharmaceuticals. And yet she lived to be 124. I'll give you 2 more, then I think you'll get the idea, and then we'll move on. But I think these are interesting, and they all tell stories.